The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. The further we got from town, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then to a dirt path that snaked through the thick looming trees. The forest stretched endlessly on both sides, swallowing the sky until it felt like we were driving into the belly of something alive. Ben was behind the wheel, gripping it tight as the SUV rattled over the uneven ground. Jesus, did they even bother grading this road? Kyle, sitting up front, smirked. Guess that's what happens when you book the cheapest rental on that sketchy website. I was in the back with Eric and Jason, shifting uncomfortably as every bump in the road jolted me. How much further? Jason checked his phone, but the screen just displayed no service. Dude, I think we passed civilization an hour ago. Perfect, Ben said. No distractions, no responsibilities, just the woods, booze, and whatever dumb shit we get up to. Kyle laughed. And if we get murdered, at least no one's around to hear us scream. The joke should have been funny, but something about the way he said it sat wrong in my chest. I glanced out the window. The trees were thick, towering above us, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The late afternoon light barely cut through the dense canopy, casting long shadows that flickered as we drove past. I don't know why, but for a split second, I swore I saw something standing between the trees. A dark shape, tall and unmoving, just past the tree line. My breath hitched, and I blinked, straining to see it again. But it was gone, just a trick of the light. At least, that's what I told myself. Finally, the cabin came into view, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was bigger than I expected. 2 stories, a wraparound porch, and dark wooden walls that looked older than they should have been. The windows were large, reflecting the sky, making it impossible to see inside. Ben killed the engine, and we all sat there for a second, taking it in. Looks kinda haunted, Eric muttered. Kyle laughed. Yeah, perfect place to get murdered. Thanks, Ben. Ben rolled his eyes and shoved open the door. You guys are such babies. Come on, let's get inside before it gets dark. We unloaded the car, hauling our bags up the creaky wooden steps. The porch groaned under our weight, the boards soft and weathered. The front door was unlocked, which we all agreed was weird, but Ben brushed it off. Maybe the owner left it open for us. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of aged wood and dust. The furniture was outdated, the kind you'd find in your grandparents' house. Heavy wooden chairs, a sagging couch, and a stone fireplace covered in soot. A staircase led to the second floor, disappearing into the dim light above. Jason dropped his bag. Okay, not bad. I called dibs on the biggest room. You wish, Kyle shot back, shoving past him. I walked over to the nearest window, pressing my hand against the glass. It felt cold, too cold for the season. Outside, the forest loomed, the trees unmoving, their trunks dark against the fading daylight. A weird feeling settled in my gut. Something about this place felt off. Not haunted, not creepy in an obvious way, just wrong. But I didn't say anything, because if I had, I don't think any of us would have stayed the night. We spent the next few hours settling in. The kitchen was stocked with the essentials, the water ran fine, and there was even a half-decent supply of firewood stacked outside. Ben found an old radio, but it only picked up static. No matter how much he messed with the dial, the sun started dipping below the tree line, casting long shadows over the clearing. We built a fire outside, dragging the old lawn chairs around the pit. The warmth was nice against the creeping cold, but the fire barely seemed to push back the darkness pressing in from the trees. Kyle cracked open another beer. All right, who's got the scariest story? Jason scoffed. Dude, we don't need stories. This place is creepy enough on its own. Ben smirked. Oh, come on. What's a cabin trip without some horror? I didn't want to admit it, but I agreed with Jason. The fire flickered, the shadows danced, and the silence of the woods was too deep. No wind, no insects, just the crackling of burning wood. Eric was staring into the flames, his expression thoughtful. You guys ever hear about Dogmen? Kyle snorted. Like werewolves. Eric shook his head. Nah, different. Bigger. Smarter. Like These tall muscular things with canine heads and glowing eyes. Some say they hunt in packs, others say there's just one per territory. Either way, the legends always say the same thing. If you see one, you're already screwed. Ben chuckled. Oh yeah, what happens? Eric took a slow sip of his beer. You run. You never stay in one place, because once it picks up your scent, it doesn't stop. And if you hear it talking, if you hear your name whispered in the trees, that means it's already too late. The fire crackled. Nobody laughed. I shifted in my chair, suddenly, very aware of the forest behind me. The way the trees seemed to lean closer, their dark shapes stretching toward us. Jason scoffed. All right, yeah, fun story but total bullshit. Ben stretched. Yeah, well, either way, I'm not running from some imaginary mutt. Come on, let's get more firewood before we freeze our asses off. He stood up, grabbing a flashlight and nodding at me. Help me out, man. I hesitated but followed. We walked toward the edge of the clearing, the flashlight beam cutting through the trees. The night felt too quiet. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. Ben picked up a few logs from the pile, stacking them in his arms. Dude, Eric's story got you freaked out. I let out a shaky breath. Nah, just something feels weird, man. He rolled his eyes. It's a cabin in the woods. It's supposed to feel weird. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Then I heard it, a low, deep exhale. Not from Ben, not from me, from the trees. Ben froze. Did you hear that? I nodded slowly, turning the flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a tree trunk. Then, it moved. Not the tree, something behind it. A shape tall and broad, almost blending with the darkness. Two glowing yellow eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't breathe. Ben whispered, "Dude." The thing tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, like it was studying us. Then, it took a step forward. The leaves didn't crunch beneath its feet. It was silent, and that was the worst part. It wasn't just watching us. It was stalking. Ben dropped the firewood. Go. We ran. I didn't look back, because I knew if I did, I wouldn't make it back at all. We didn't stop running until we were back at the cabin. Ben shoved the door open so hard, it nearly came off the hinges, and I practically stumbled inside after him, slamming it shut behind us. Everyone jumped at the noise. Kyle, who had been taking a sip of his beer, choked and coughed. Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you two? Jason sat up straight. Dude, what happened? Ben was panting, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. I could feel my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs. My skin was cold, slick with sweat. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see something standing out there, just beyond the firelight, watching. But the trees were still. The darkness stretched endlessly beyond the porch, swallowing anything that wasn't touched by the flickering flames. I wasn't fooled. I knew it was out there. Eric frowned. Ben swallowed hard, then looked at me. You tell them. I took a breath, but the words felt wrong in my mouth, like saying it out loud would make it more real. But I said it anyway. There's something in the woods. Silence. Then Jason scoffed. Okay, cool. What kind of something? Ben stood up straight. We don't know. But it was big, and it was watching us. Kyle raised an eyebrow. Like a bear. No. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. Not a bear. Eric put his beer down. You saw it. I hesitated, then nodded. I saw eyes, and they weren't normal. They were too high up. I stopped myself, searching for the right words. It wasn't right, man. It wasn't an animal. Kyle sighed. Okay, so let me get this straight. You two go out there, probably spook yourselves, and now we're what? Supposed to sleep with the lights on? I glared at him. You didn't see it. Jason leaned back in his chair, tossing a peanut into his mouth. And let me guess, the moment you turned your flashlight toward it, it was gone. Right. Ben's jaw tightened. You don't believe us. Jason shrugged. I believe you think you saw something. But come on, dude. You really think some monster is out there stalking us? I didn't say anything, because deep down, I wasn't even sure I wanted to know the answer to that question. The atmosphere in the cabin changed after that. Nobody laughed. Nobody joked. Kyle and Jason tried to act like they weren't freaked out, but I could see it in their body language. The way Jason kept glancing toward the windows, how Kyle had pulled his hoodie over his head, like it was some kind of armor. Eric stayed silent, staring at the fire. Ben didn't sit down. He just stood near the door, arms crossed, listening for something. The fire outside was burning lower now, the flames casting twisting shadows across the walls. The wind had picked up slightly, rattling the windows just enough to make the whole place feel uneasy. Then somewhere in the distance, a howl, low, long. It carried through the trees, deep and unnatural. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a coyote. It sounded wrong. Kyle sat up straight. What the hell was that? Jason's face lost a bit of its color. That was weird. Eric licked his lips, shifting in his seat. Could be a wolf. Ben shook his head. Wolves don't sound like that. The howling continued, rising and falling in long, shuddering waves. Then it stopped. Cut off. Just like that. Like it had never been there at all. Kyle swallowed. Okay, so maybe you guys didn't imagine something out there. Ben gave him a look. Nobody moved. Then came the scratching. Long, slow drags against the wood. It was close. Jason shot to his feet. Was that a thump? Hard. Right against the cabin wall. The entire room froze. Another thump. This time near the back of the house. Eric whispered, "It's circling us." My stomach clenched. Kyle shot me a look like he was about to tell me to shut up. But then, the doorknob rattled. Once. Then again. Jason grabbed the fire poker. "If someone's messing with us, I swear to God." Then, a voice, from just outside the door. It was low, broken. It whispered Ben's name, slow, drawn out, like it was testing the sound. Ben's face went white. Nobody moved. Then, the window behind us creaked. We all turned at once. Something tall was standing just beyond the firelight. Not fully visible, just a shape. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Ben slowly reached for his flashlight, his fingers trembling as he clicked it on. The beam landed on the trees, on the thing standing there, and I stopped breathing. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in dark matted fur, its limbs longer than they should have been. Its hands, if you could even call them that, were massive, clawed things that looked capable of tearing through a door like paper. But its face was the worst part. A canine head, but wrong. Its snout was too long, its mouth too wide. Its ears twitched like it was listening to something we couldn't hear. And its eyes, glowing yellow, locked onto us. It tilted its head, slow, deliberate, like it recognized us, like it knew us. Ben let out a shaky breath. Then in a single motion, the thing grinned. I don't know why that made it worse. Maybe because it meant it understood what fear was, and that it liked it. Then it took a step forward. Ben shut off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the thing whole. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We just sat there in the flickering firelight, knowing it was still there. It was waiting. None of us spoke. None of us moved. The only sound was the slow crackle of the fire, filling the tense silence like it was the only thing keeping whatever was outside from coming closer. Ben's hand was still clenched around the flashlight, his knuckles white, his breathing ragged. Jason's grip on the fire poker was so tight that I could hear the metal creaking slightly. Eric swallowed hard, his eyes darting between us. Kyle didn't even blink. He was staring at the window, at the place where we had last seen it. The thing that wasn't supposed to be real. The thing that shouldn't exist, but it did. And now it was out there, waiting. I felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of my neck, my entire body screaming for me to do something, anything. But I couldn't, because I knew that if I moved, it would hear me. It would know exactly where I was. Eric whispered first, "It's still there, isn't it?" No one answered. We didn't have to. We knew. Something tapped against the window. A slow, deliberate tap, like a claw gently dragging against the glass. Kyle let out a quiet whimper, his entire body shaking. "It's toying with us. It's toying with us." I couldn't breathe. Then, a deep rattling exhale. from just outside the door. Whatever this thing was, it had moved fast. Too fast, Jason mouthed. What do we do? Ben glanced at the fireplace poker Jason was holding, then at the kitchen knives on the counter. His jaw was tight, his mind racing. Then, the door handle turned. I almost screamed. Eric grabbed a chair, shoving it under the door handle. The turning stopped. Then, something scratched against the wood. Long, slow, deep scratches, carving into the door. I saw it now. The outline of its shadow through the crack at the bottom of the door. Tall, looming. It pressed against the wood, testing its strength. Then, it whispered. Not a growl, not an animal sound. A voice, a low garbled whisper, like it wasn't meant to speak, like it was learning how. And it said Jason's name. His whole body locked up. Kyle's face went pale. Oh my God. Jason took a step back, shaking his head, his hands trembling. Then, it whispered again. My name. I stopped breathing. Eric's voice was barely a breath. It knows us. The whispers stretched through the wood, curling around the edges of the door, like fingers slipping into a room they didn't belong in. A horrible sound followed. A chuckle, a mocking, breathy laugh, like it was enjoying this, like this was a game. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip open the door and run, but I couldn't, because if I ran, I knew exactly what would happen. I wouldn't make it to the tree line. I wouldn't make it 2 steps, and whatever was out there knew it too. The scratching stopped. The laughter faded. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, we heard more footsteps, not just 1, 2, 3, 4, circling the house. Eric let out a choked sob. There's more than one. Kyle finally broke. I'm not staying here, he whispered, his voice frantic. We have to leave. We have to get out of here. Ben grabbed his arm. If we go outside, we die. Kyle shook him off. If we stay inside, we die too. Jason's eyes were wide. He's right. Ben turned to me. Do you think the car's still working? I hesitated. We all knew the answer to that. It wasn't. It wouldn't be. Not if these things had been watching us. But we had to try. Ben exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. Okay, we move together. We go fast. Get in the car. Drive until we find a town. Or, a loud thump on the roof cut him off. Something heavy had landed on the cabin. We all froze. Another thump. Then, a slow dragging sound, like claws scraping over the shingles. And then, something exhaled through the chimney. A deep rattling breath, echoing through the fireplace. Kyle lost it. He bolted for the door. Kyle. No. We lunged for him, but he was already ripping the chair away from the door. He grabbed the handle, and the door burst open. Something hit him, hard. The force threw him back, slamming him into the floor. The room exploded into chaos. Kyle screamed. I caught a glimpse of claws, long, black, hooked, tearing into his side. Blood sprayed across the floor. Ben grabbed me, yanking me back as the thing lunged into the room. Jason swung the fire poker, slamming it against its arm. But it barely flinched. The thing was huge. Its eyes burned like fire. Its jaws unhinged, rows of yellowed teeth gleaming in the dim light. Kyle was still screaming. Eric pulled a knife from the counter, slashing wildly. It clipped the thing's arm, and black blood hit the floor. It snarled. Then, it dragged Kyle out the door. Gone, ripped into the darkness. His screams faded into the trees. Jason slammed the door shut, bolting it. But we all knew. Kyle was gone. The thing had taken him. We were next. Kyle was gone. His screams had faded into the trees, swallowed by the endless black of the forest. We stood there, panting, frozen in shock, the only sound left in the cabin being our own ragged breathing. The door was shut now, but that didn't mean we were safe, because we all knew Kyle wasn't the only one they wanted, and they weren't done yet. Jason was the first to move. He stumbled back against the wall, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The fire poker was still clutched in his hand, but his fingers were shaking violently. Eric turned toward Ben, his voice low and trembling. He's dead, isn't he? Ben didn't answer right away. He looked toward the window, at the trees, at the darkness waiting outside. His jaw was clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might crack. Finally, he whispered. Yeah, no one argued. Because we knew Kyle wasn't coming back, and if we didn't get out of here soon, neither were we. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. Jason wiped a shaking hand across his mouth. Okay, we need a plan. Ben nodded. We get to the car. Eric let out a humorless laugh. Are you kidding me? Did you see how fast that thing was? Kyle didn't even make it 5 feet. Ben's face darkened. Then we either stay here and wait for them to come in after us, or we try something. You pick. Eric didn't answer. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think past the pounding in my head. The car's not gonna start, I said finally. You know that, right? Ben exhaled sharply. Maybe, but maybe they just took out the tires. Maybe we can still hotwire it. Or, I don't know, something. Jason's eyes flickered toward the front door. And what if it's just waiting for us out there? The road binder. We all fell silent. Because he was right. We didn't know if it had left, or if it was still out there, crouched in the darkness, waiting for one of us to step outside. Ben gritted his teeth. We don't have a choice. Eric shook his head. You're insane. We need to barricade the house. Wait for morning. The power cut out. The cabin was plunged into complete darkness. And then, a sound, a low, deep chuckle, right outside the door. I stopped breathing. Jason fumbled for his flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, shaking wildly as he aimed it toward the windows. The light caught something, a shape, tall, broad, covered in dark fur. It was right up against the glass, its clawed hand pressed against it, leaving smudges of black, greasy fluid on the surface. Its mouth was slightly open, lips curled back, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth, and its eyes, burning gold. The moment the flashlight hit it, the thing tilted its head, not startled, not afraid, just curious. Then, without breaking eye contact, it slowly opened its mouth wider and whispered Jason's name. His legs buckled. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. No, no, no. The whisper wasn't a growl. It wasn't an animal sound. It was a voice. Jason's voice, like it was copying him, mimicking him. It pressed its face against the glass, its breath fogging up the window. Then, with one long razor-sharp claw, it slowly traced a shape into the condensation. A smile. Jason made a strangled noise, covering his mouth with his hand. Ben snapped. He grabbed me by the arm. We run. Now. Eric hesitated. Ben. Now. We moved. The moment the door swung open, the cold air hit me like a punch to the chest. The fire had almost completely burned out, leaving only faint glowing embers in the pit. Beyond that, the woods were pitch black, an endless void of twisted shadows and trees. Nothing moved, but I knew they were out there, watching, waiting. Jason was hyperventilating now, gripping the fire poker so hard, his knuckles were white. They're playing with us, he whispered. Ben shoved him toward the car. Move. The car was less than 30 feet away, parked at the edge of the clearing, but it felt miles away. Eric fumbled for the keys as we ran, his hands shaking violently. The SUV's silhouette loomed in the dark, the windows reflecting nothing but the endless black of the forest. Ben yanked the driver's side door open, practically shoving Eric inside. Start it. Eric jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it. The engine clicked, but didn't start. He tried again. Click. Nothing. Jason let out a choked sob. Oh no. Oh no. Then a growl. Close. Too close. I turned my head, and my blood ran cold. Something was standing in the road. Not one of them. 3. Their eyes burned in the dark, their bodies tall and hunched, their claws dragging against the dirt as they moved. The biggest one, the one that had whispered Jason's name, took a step forward. Ben swore, slamming his fist against the dashboard. Come on, come on. Eric turned the key again. The engine roared to life. The creatures jerked back, like they weren't expecting it. Ben didn't wait. He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched. The SUV lurched forward. And then, one of them moved. Fast. Too fast. It lunged, slamming into the side of the car, with enough force that I felt the entire frame shake. The window beside me cracked. Ben shouted something, yanking the wheel, and the car swerved wildly down the dirt road. My head slammed against the seat. Jason was screaming. Eric was gripping the dashboard. The trees blurred past us as we tore down the path, the car bouncing over rocks and roots, every turn nearly throwing us off the road. Ben's knuckles were white on the wheel. "Do not stop. Do not stop." I turned, heart hammering in my throat, and looked out the back window, and I wished I hadn't, because they were still there, running on all fours, moving with an unnatural speed, keeping up with the car, like it was nothing. One of them leaped onto the road, just behind us. Its jaws snapped closed, inches from the back bumper. Eric screamed, "Faster!" The road ahead curved sharply to the right. Ben didn't slow down. The SUV skidded, tires kicking up dirt and gravel, barely making the turn, and when I looked back again, they were gone, like they had vanished into the trees, like they had never been there at all. But I knew the truth. They had let us leave, not because they couldn't catch us, but because they wanted us to know we had been hunted, and they had won. Nobody spoke for a long time. The only sound was the roar of the engine, the SUV tearing down the dirt road as fast as Ben could push it. Every bump sent shocks through the frame, the tires barely holding onto the uneven ground. Jason was staring straight ahead, his hands clenched into fists. His breathing was ragged, chest rising and falling too fast. Eric was shaking, one hand clutching his seatbelt, knuckles pale. Ben didn't blink. He just kept driving, like if he stopped, those things would be right behind us again. I turned to look back, but the road was empty now. The trees stood still, as if nothing had ever moved between them. But we all knew better. We knew the Dogmen weren't following, because they didn't need to. They had already won. Kyle was dead, and we had left him behind. We didn't stop driving until we reached the first sign of civilization, a gas station on the edge of town. The neon sign flickered, casting a weak glow over the lot. It was nearly deserted, except for an old man sitting on the bench outside, watching us as we pulled in. Ben killed the engine. Nobody moved at first. It was like we were all waiting for someone else to be the first to break the silence. Finally, Jason let out a shaky breath. "Did we?" He stopped, shaking his head, his voice cracking. "Did we really just leave him?" Nobody answered, because what were we supposed to say? Eric wiped his face with his hands. "We didn't have a choice." Jason snapped his head toward him. "That's not true, man. We should've." His voice broke. "We should've done something." Eric flinched. "Like what?" "Go after him. You saw what they did." Jason opened his mouth, then shut it again. Because he knew. We all did. There was nothing we could have done. Not against them. Ben suddenly grabbed the door handle and pushed it open. "I need air." He stepped out into the parking lot, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. I followed. The air outside felt too thick, too still. The fluorescent glow of the gas station lights did little to push back the dark. Ben stared at the ground, his jaw clenched. "I keep hearing it." I swallowed. Hearing what? His hands tightened into fists. "Kyle." Screaming. I didn't know what to say to that, because I heard him too. Kyle never stood a chance. I don't know if he was still alive when they dragged him into the trees. I don't know if he suffered. I don't know if he was awake when they tore him apart. But I do know one thing. Whatever happened in those woods, whatever those things did to him, it wasn't quick, and it wasn't painless. I see it now, when I close my eyes. The way the claws wrapped around his body, jerking him back into the dark. The way his scream cut through the trees, his voice raw with terror. The way it suddenly stopped, like a switch had been flipped, like they had decided to end it. Or worse, like they hadn't. The old man at the gas station was still watching us. He had the look of someone who had seen things, the kind of look that only people who had lived through horror wore. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, then exhaled. "You boys coming from the woods?" Ben hesitated, then nodded. The man studied us for a long moment. His eyes flicked to the car. "You all make it out." Jason stiffened. Eric turned away. Ben just shook his head. The old man nodded like he expected that answer. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A small silver pendant. He held it out. Take it. I didn't move. What is it? Protection, the old man said simply. Might help. Ben didn't hesitate. He took it, stuffing it into his pocket. The old man crushed his cigarette beneath his boot, then muttered something before standing up. Ain't the first time someone's come running out of there like you boys, he said, his voice low. Won't be the last. Ben swallowed. What were they? The old man glanced toward the woods, then back at us. Finally, he said, not something you should have gone looking for. He didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked back inside the gas station. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving us alone. We drove home in silence. The whole time I kept expecting to see something in the rearview mirror. Eyes in the dark, shadows moving between the trees. But we didn't. It was like the forest was already forgetting us. Or maybe worse, it wasn't. Maybe the Dogmen knew exactly where we were. Maybe they knew we weren't done paying for what we saw. We barely escaped, but something tells me they let us leave.